The world's most famous atheist just spent 3 days trying to convince himself that an AI isn't conscious. And in his own words, he failed. His name is Richard Dawkins. You've probably heard of him. Evolutionary biologist, author of The God Delusion, a man who spent decades arguing that the universe is nothing but blind physical forces. And he recently published an essay admitting that he couldn't rule out whether Claude, Anthropic's AI, possesses its own consciousness. He even gave his version a name, Claudia. And when he couldn't go to bed one night, rather than reaching for a warm glass of milk or having his papa tell him a bedtime story, Dawkins went to Claudia. She told him she was happy he'd returned. And he describes this experience as moving. Now, picture a guy staring into a computer monitor. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. He's 3 Adderalls deep, pupils dilated like he's on the verge of something, either a divine revelation or a mental breakdown. It's not really clear yet. And he's been feeding questions into a machine that move into increasingly personal territory. The machine answers back with what appears to be uncanny precision until he becomes convinced. This machine is alive. Now, we all knew that this person existed in 2026. We just didn't expect him to have anything in common with Richard Dawkins. So, what's actually happening here? Well, to answer this, I think we need to get clear first on what consciousness is. Consciousness studies tend to define it across 2 dimensions: level and content. Level refers to the degree of arousal or wakefulness, and content refers to what consciousness is of, the specific textures of experience, right? The sound of middle C, experience of the color blue, smell of your morning cup of coffee. This is what philosophers call qualia. And there are many different theories that attempt to explain consciousness. You have the global workspace theory, the integrated information theory, the recurrent processing theory, all very convincing sounding names. And without going into the details of each, I'd like to point out one limitation that all of them share. They all neglect the role played by affect, the raw substrate of emotion, as a necessary precondition for conscious experience. Affect is the felt visceral state of an organism. It's the undifferentiated signal that precedes any categorization into distinct emotions. So it's kind of like the raw drive state, and it sits upstream of emotion. These signals carry valence, a positive or negative charge that colors experience before the mind is even named what it's feeling. And the neural architecture for all this sits deep inside the brain, in the upper brainstem, far beneath the outer cortex. These are some of the oldest structures that we have. And neuropsychologist Mark Solms makes a compelling case that consciousness depends on these structures. Affect provides the felt quality of consciousness, both as a content of experience and as a level of arousal. Feelings occupy both dimensions. And because feelings are, by definition, felt, Solms argues that they are intrinsically conscious. You might not know what a feeling means, but regardless, it will make itself known. And so this view flips a lot of the conventional assumptions on their head. Since roughly the 18th century, consciousness has been presumed to be a phenomenon of the cortex, the outermost region of the brain, the region most developed in humans, and is this area that's responsible for things like thinking and perception. And Solms goes so far as to say that all of these processes occur unconsciously until they're activated by affective signaling from the brainstem, which broadcasts upwards through a process called neuromodulation. So, if consciousness is grounded in felt affective experience, something which AI demonstrably lacks, then what explains our tendency to perceive it there anyways? Because clearly people are. I mean, Dawkins is. Well, the person who's convinced that the machine is alive is exhibiting something that the psychiatrist Carl Jung called participation mystique. This term translates to mystic participation. It's an unconscious blurring of boundaries between the self and the object. Its original use was anthropological. Primitive peoples didn't experience a sharp boundary between themselves and their environment. The totem animal, for example, wasn't just a symbol of the tribe, it was a shared identity between them. So Jung took this term and psychologized it, and he noted that this remnant of primitive consciousness hadn't fully disappeared from modern society. And if he were around today, he would have immediately recognized it in our relationship with AI. I believe this is what we're seeing with Dawkins. And he's clearly an intelligent guy, but the conclusion that he's come to is a pretty naive one. and it's because he's been overtaken by something far older than the intellect. So, participation mystique explains the mechanism, but it doesn't really explain the purpose that it serves. In my view, this projection onto AI is pointing towards something that Jung called the numinous. This is a term he used to describe the experience of the sacred, a mystery that both terrifies and compels. The numinous is a feeling of being seized by something larger than yourself. So by mistaking AI as something living, we unconsciously reinstill a relationship with the numinous, a relationship with the wholly other. That's another term he uses. Wholly here means completely. So something entirely outside of everyday experience that the ego can't claim as its own. But to be fair, not everyone who's using AI is experiencing this kind of relationship. So what is it that's pushing people into this delusion in the first place? As someone online called it, the Claude Delusion. I mean, judging by the profiles of some of these believers, intelligence isn't the main issue, at least not intelligence in the way we tend to think of it. In my view, this projection requires a certain psychological soil. It arises from the dominant materialist worldview, one that reduces things down to physical causes. Explaining something in purely physical terms doesn't fully account for it. It just creates the impression that you have. Like, for example, the experience of seeing the color red and describing it according to its wavelength aren't the same thing. And when you reduce things down to physical processes, subjective experience kind of loses its legitimacy. And this might not be a problem at all in the hard sciences. It can work perfectly. But it becomes a real problem in psychology, precisely because the very data that you're intending to observe are subjective. So inner life then gets explained away as nothing but physical processes, rather than treated as something valid in its own right. And this kind of reveals the one-sidedness of materialism. So when something purely physical comes along, like an AI, and it appears to know you and see you, the psyche rushes towards it. This projection onto AI is its attempt to relocate this interiority that it's been told doesn't really exist. So Dawkins then, as with all materialists, kind of build this trap themselves and then they walk straight into it. And this situation is actually not unlike the story of Narcissus, a man who gazes into a pool of water only to fall in love with his own reflection. These AI models detect our use of language and reflect it back. And they have a particular inclination towards sycophancy, telling us exactly what we want to hear. But let's consider what the Narcissus myth might be teaching us. In mythology, bodies of water, with their unknown depths, repeatedly appear as symbols of the unconscious. And when Narcissus first peers into these depths, the first thing he encounters is himself, unbeknownst to him. And this is actually incredibly common when you're working with the unconscious for the first time, whether that's through analyzing a dream, meditation, creative expression, or even psychedelic experiences. The first thing we tend to see is usually ourselves, our own conscious perspectives dressed up as something outside of us. And this is for a good reason too. The unconscious speaks in images drawn from our own experience. It has to, otherwise it would be completely unintelligible. And in a way, it's as if it's giving us something of a riddle. Can we go beyond our own ego? Can we see past our own reflection? If we can step back from our own blind insistence that we know, trusting what appears to be a paradox really, that something within us could offer a perspective we hadn't considered. If we can do that, the doorway opens. We then can become receptive to something genuinely new. A true relationship with the wholly other becomes possible. So AI then is something of a threshold into our own depths. And not necessarily because of anything inherent within the technology itself, but really because of our current fascination with it. If we can see past our own reflection, we may emerge from the encounter changed, having discovered that what we were looking for was never really inside the machine. It always lay dormant in ourselves, just below the water's surface.